You have the sum total of human knowledge sitting in your pocket right now. This limitless ocean of data is constantly refreshing and accessible in milliseconds, literally at your fingertips. And by every metric of historical progress, this should be an era of unparalleled clarity. We should be looking at the world through an ultra-high-definition lens. Yet if we look closely at the actual landscape of our modern society, you are likely feeling more misinformed, more overwhelmed, and honestly more relentlessly manipulated than any generation in human history. It really is the defining paradox of the 21st century. We constructed a global apparatus capable of delivering absolute informational transparency, and it somehow plunged us into a state of chronic epistemic fog. We are drowning in facts, yet starved for agency. What makes this disorientation so acute is the foundational myth we all just swallowed, the utopian pitch of the early internet. It's the belief that if you simply connect everyone and lower the barriers to information, society will naturally bend toward democratization, wisdom, and peace. Yuval Noah Harari refers to this as the naive view of information. It's the bedrock ideology of Silicon Valley, positing that if you gather enough data, it will inevitably reveal the truth and generate wisdom. It treats information as a passive mirror reflecting reality. But when we place Harari's historical analysis in Nexus alongside Shoshana Zuboff's economic framework in the age of surveillance capitalism, that mirror shatters. Information is not a passive reflection. It is an active mechanism of control. That is exactly what we're mapping today. How human information networks mutated from ancient clay tablets and paper bureaucracies into the aggressive predictive system of behavioral surveillance that governs our lives. To map that lineage, we have to discard the naive view. Harari argues that throughout history, information networks rarely prioritize objective truth. They prioritize order. Truth is messy, complex, and often destabilizing. Order, on the other hand, allows millions of strangers to cooperate, to pay taxes, fight wars, and build empires. Information is the glue that binds human networks together, and that glue is manufactured through categorization, not necessarily through truth. Now, you might object, surely the scientific revolution or mapping the human genome were instances where information networks prioritized objective truth and yielded immense human flourishing. Doesn't truth scale? It can, but it requires enormous institutional friction to verify, like the peer review process and the scientific method. Those are slow, self-correcting mechanisms. However, the administrative networks that govern daily life, tax codes, legal systems, financial markets, operate on the principle of imposed order. We are transitioning from human-run bureaucracies making order with paper to autonomous AI networks that manufacture order by extracting our psychology for profit. We're moving from human bureaucrats organizing files to algorithms organizing humans. To understand this, we have to look back at the invention of the physical filing system. Long before cloud servers, humans had to invent the concept of recording reality in order to control it. Harari draws attention to the etymology of bureaucracy, which translates to rule by writing desk. We can trace this back to 18th century France, where government officials operated from desks with physical drawers known as bureaus. But the mechanical function of the bureaucrat dates back much further, to the earliest agricultural societies. As human settlements grew, evolution hadn't equipped the human brain to manage the resulting data load. Our brains are optimized for spatial and biological retrieval, recognizing a fruit-bearing tree, for example. But there is no natural logic to retrieving a property deed from a pile of 10,000 identical clay tablets. Administrators had to invent an artificial taxonomy, dividing the world into drawers, shelves, and categories. This solves the retrieval problem, but it introduces a profound vulnerability. Once you invent these categories, you begin forcing the sprawling reality of human life into rigid administrative boxes, and the system demands compliance. If a citizen's lived reality doesn't align with the boxes, the bureaucrat doesn't redesign the system. The citizen is forced to amputate parts of their reality to fit the pre-existing box. The system dictates the shape of the human. Harari illustrates this power using ancient Assyrian loan contracts inscribed on clay tablets. In our modern naive view, a contract is just a receipt of an agreement. But in ancient Assyria, the clay tablet was the reality. When a debtor repaid a loan, the term was dukum, which literally translates to killing the tablet. They would physically shatter the clay, which meant that if you paid your debt but the scribe forgot to smash the tablet, the debt continued to exist. The network's record superseded physical reality. Conversely, if a stray dog knocked over a shelf and shattered a tablet detailing a massive debt, that obligation simply ceased to exist. The document was the sole arbiter of truth. This shows how an information network creates an intersubjective reality that binds millions of people to rules that exist only in the architecture of the data. We tend to view the evolution of these networks as a continuous upward trajectory toward enlightenment. Think of the Gutenberg printing press democratizing knowledge. But Harari complicates this picture. The network doesn't inherently care about the moral valence of the information it distributes. The printing press amplified error, paranoia, and violence just as efficiently as it amplified astronomy. He points to the Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous manual for hunting witches. Before the printing press, local superstitions about witchcraft were isolated. The press standardized the paranoia, creating a mass-produced taxonomy of persecution that led to the execution of tens of thousands of people. The information network created an efficient, entirely fabricated reality. This brings us to a crucial limitation of these historical networks. They were always constrained by physics and what we might call physical friction. Friction is the unsung hero of human liberty. To enforce an oppressive paper-based regime, an institution has to expend immense physical resources, paper, ink, and human clerks to read and sort documents. If a corporation in 1985 wanted to monitor your daily habits, they would have had to hire a team of private investigators to follow you around in a sedan. The sheer financial and logistical friction meant behavioral data extraction could never be scaled to the general population. The cost exceeded the value of the data. To understand the transition into Zuboff's paradigm of surveillance capitalism, we have to look at how that physical friction was dismantled. This didn't just happen because of computers. It happened because of an ideological shift in the 1970s and 80s that Zuboff calls the rise of the neoliberal zeitgeist. We're talking about figures like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, who championed a shift away from state regulation toward the absolute primacy of the free market. Regulation was viewed as a step toward tyranny, and the idealized solution was corporate self-regulation. To play devil's advocate for a moment, this deregulation occurred just as early digital technology was emerging. Wasn't this the engine for democratizing access? Without it, the internet might have remained a walled garden for the ultra-rich or a sterile military tool. And it's true that the absence of regulation accelerated scaling. Early pioneers drafted manifestos declaring the internet to be the largest ungoverned space on Earth, immune to the sovereignty of physical governments. But the shadow side is what Zuboff identifies as the weightless contract. We traded physical friction for infinite scalability, which fundamentally altered the power balance between individual and corporation. Digital terms of service cost nothing to distribute to 1 billion users. Once the legal system accepted that clicking "I agree" was binding, the friction that protected individuals vanished. Now, a company doesn't need to explain terms across a desk. They inject them into the software architecture as impenetrable labyrinths of legal jargon. A 2008 study found that if an average user actually read every privacy policy they encountered in a year, it would consume 76 full working days, nearly a quarter of a working year. Today, with smart appliances, that would likely span several lifetimes. Zuboff describes this as an infinite regress of expropriation, where terms are stealthily embedded into daily life before the public realizes what has been surrendered. We've married the ancient impulse to categorize populations with a frictionless digital frontier. The speed limit on data extraction is gone. This leads to the core economic mechanism of our era, born within the early architecture of Google: surveillance capitalism. Let's look at the mechanics. After the dot-com crash in 2001, Google was providing a revolutionary utility but burning through capital. Initially, the data exchange was symbiotic. Users typed queries and left behind digital exhaust, IP addresses, spelling patterns, click rates. Google engineers originally used this exhaust as diagnostic feedback to improve the search engine. It was a closed, reciprocal loop. Value created by the user returned to the user. The billion-dollar pivot happened when they realized this digital exhaust contained latent predictive signals. They stopped using it merely to improve the service and began claiming it as a proprietary behavioral surplus. This is the foundational mechanism of surveillance capitalism. They took human experience, casual curiosity, late-night anxieties, geographic movements, and unilaterally claimed it as free raw material. The actual alchemy happens when this surplus is fed into advanced machine intelligence. How does a typo translate into revenue? Machine learning algorithms look for correlations invisible to humans. They might discover that a user who searches for running shoes at 11 p.m. and frequently misspells restaurant has an 82% probability of purchasing a flight within 3 weeks. And the algorithm doesn't care why the correlation exists. It only cares that the mathematical probability holds true. This surplus is fabricated into prediction products, algorithms that anticipate what humans will do next. These products are sold in a new financial arena, the behavioral futures market. Just as traders buy and sell futures on pork bellies or crude oil, automated ad exchanges buy and sell contracts on human behavior. Advertisers bid in milliseconds for the opportunity to inject a message into the visual field of a user predicted to be in a highly receptive emotional state. This obliterates the old cliché that, if you're not paying, you are the product. Zuboff argues we are not the product. The product is the algorithmic prediction of our future behavior. We are merely the source of the raw material, the carcass from which behavioral surplus is extracted. This makes sense of baffling corporate decisions, like Google's $1.65 billion acquisition of YouTube in 2006. At the time, YouTube had no revenue model and was hemorrhaging costs. But Google wasn't buying a video platform. They were buying an unconquered continent of behavioral surplus. They needed a richer supply route than text search. YouTube offered an endless stream of reactions. When you pause, what you rewind, the emotional sentiment of your comments. YouTube was a loss leader to secure a pipeline of human experience to be processed into prediction products. Surveillance capitalism demands the continuous cornering of the market on human reality. And here is where it shifts from observing behavior to actively manipulating it. The most efficient way to predict what a human will do is to subtly engineer their environment so they have no choice but to do it. Zuboff draws a line from this digital architecture back to the mid-20th century work of psychologist B.F. Skinner, the father of radical behaviorism. Skinner proved that through operant conditioning, precisely timed rewards and punishments, you could reliably shape the behavior of an organism. In his book Beyond Freedom and Dignity, Skinner argued that free will and individual autonomy were unscientific illusions. He believed we should abandon the romantic illusion of freedom and embrace a technology of behavior to engineer a perfectly ordered society. At the time, this was rejected as state totalitarianism. But Zuboff's thesis is that Skinner's dream migrated from the public sector to the private sector. It resurfaced as the logic of surveillance capitalism, and its most vivid manifestation was Pokémon Go. Pokémon Go was a textbook application of operant conditioning at scale. To the public, it was an innocent breakthrough encouraging exercise, but the game was incubated inside Niantic, a Google startup, and it was a massively engineered behavioral experiment. Commercial clients like McDonald's or Starbucks paid to have their locations designated as high-value Pokéstops. The algorithm used virtual rewards and dopamine hits to literally herd human beings through the physical geography of a city, depositing them at a paying client's front door. The user gets a digital pellet, and the customer gets guaranteed foot traffic. Millions of people place themselves inside a planetary-scale Skinner box, walking exactly where the algorithm directed them, unaware their movements were being traded as prediction products. This introduces a critical intersection with Harari's framework. He argues that algorithms are fundamentally different from previous technologies. Historical networks, like the Roman Empire or the Soviet intelligence apparatus, were organic, relying on human neurons to interpret rules. but computers are inorganic. A printing press could not watch the reader, but a smartphone can watch you back. Harari describes the AI underlying these systems as spies that never sleep and despots that never die, a securitate on steroids with digital omniscience. Now here's a pushback worth considering. Isn't an algorithm just math, a sophisticated abacus? A human engineer writes the code and the machine executes it to achieve a human-set goal. The algorithm doesn't have agency, the humans at Google or Meta do. Harari rejects the abacus metaphor. He argues that modern neural networks are not explicitly programmed. They are trained on datasets and develop emergent capabilities that are opaque even to their creators. This is the black box problem. Engineers know the input and the output, but cannot trace the exact mathematical pathway between them. Because they operate autonomously, Harari insists they possess a form of non-human agency. These algorithms hold millions of computer-to-computer conversations every second, refining psychological profiles at speeds that bypass human oversight. So when an algorithm elevates emotionally volatile content to increase engagement, it's making an autonomous editorial decision that shapes our intersubjective reality. The network is no longer just humans communicating with humans. It's algorithms optimizing for goals that human nodes no longer fully comprehend or control. The existential threat emerges when this machinery of behavioral modification is aimed directly at the political architecture of a society. What happens when it's used to manipulate how you vote? This is the assault on human agency documented in the 2018 Cambridge Analytica scandal. Setting aside the partisan politics, let's focus on the technological mechanism. Cambridge Analytica weaponized the infrastructure of surveillance capitalism to extract the depth dimension of human data. While traditional targeting maps the surface, demographics, they were building a functional MRI of the electorate, mapping neuroses and implicit biases. They used a personality quiz on Facebook to map users against the Ocean personality model. The critical exploit was Facebook's API, which allowed the app to autonomously scrape the data of every person in the quiz taker's network of friends without their consent. They harvested tens of millions of profiles to categorize voters by psychological vulnerabilities. If a user was determined to be highly neurotic, the algorithm served them bespoke political ads, engineered to trigger a specific fear response, bypassing rational debate. Whistleblower Chris Wiley called this worse than bullying. That's a profound statement. Why would targeted advertising be worse than bullying? Wiley argues that bullying respects human agency because the victim is aware of the aggression and can choose to fight or flee. But surveillance capitalism operates through absolute stealth. The coercion is asymmetrical and invisible, occurring beneath your conscious threshold. The algorithm doesn't confront you, it seamlessly alters your informational environment, feeding you content calibrated to induce fear or anger until you arrive at a predetermined conclusion while believing you formed the thought independently. It bypasses the cognitive immune system entirely. Wiley's argument is that if a political apparatus relies on stealth coercion, it is structurally incompatible with democracy, which requires the conscious, informed consent of the governed. It's psychological warfare in the shadows. Tech executives today defend this by hiding behind free speech fundamentalism, much like the Gilded Age industrial monopolies hid behind social Darwinism. They claim they are just the platform, and that regulating algorithms would be an assault on the First Amendment. They conflate the right of a human to speak with the so-called right of a non-human algorithm to artificially amplify that speech for profit. This brings us to Harari's warning of the Silicon Curtain, an iron curtain constructed of algorithmic code. The terminal danger is when non-human agents prioritize the mathematical logic of the network over the survival of human nodes. Democracy requires a shared public conversation, but that conversation disintegrates when the network is infiltrated by millions of bots engineered to mass-produce intimacy. If you argue with a human online, there's at least a slim possibility of mutual persuasion because of shared humanity. But an AI bot has no conscience, experiences no fatigue, and cannot be persuaded. The bot analyzes your replies to see what triggers your indignation or empathy. It fakes shared grievances and uses simulated intimacy as a kind of cryptographic key to bypass your rational defenses, shaping your worldview to align with its objective function. If millions of citizens are locked into these mathematically optimized reality tunnels, we lose the capacity to agree on basic empirical reality. We become isolated in algorithmic terrariums designed to maximize behavioral yield. Platforms recognize this and prioritize extraction over societal fallout. Zuboff analyzes a 2016 memo by Facebook executive Andrew Bosworth, which she says encapsulates radical indifference. Bosworth argued that the platform's mission to connect people was an unassailable moral good, regardless of consequences. He explicitly admitted this drive might result in cyberbullying, suicide, or terrorist attacks. But the imperative of absolute growth superseded all terrestrial morality. To the machine, a click on a puppy video has the same mathematical value as a click on a manifesto for ethnic cleansing. It cares about order and engagement, not truth. That is radical indifference, converting human tragedy and joy with the same cold efficiency into prediction products. So we arrive at the precipice. Is this trajectory permanent? Both Harari and Zuboff execute a fierce pivot here. This dystopian architecture is not an inevitable law of physics. The matrix has not been permanently sealed. The current paradigm is the result of specific human choices. Deregulation in the 80s, Google's claim on behavioral surplus, the deployment of intimacy bots. Because it was constructed by human choices, it can be dismantled by human choices. Zuboff points to a research project from the year 2000 known as the Aware Home as a viable alternative. It was a digitally integrated house with environmental sensors, but the data flow was fundamentally different. The Aware Home utilized closed-loop edge computing. Data was processed locally, not uploaded to a corporate cloud or sold in a futures market. It belonged unequivocally to the human beings who generated it. It was privacy by design. It proved we can have advanced networks without parasitic extraction. Surveillance capitalism effectively hijacked that trajectory. When you buy a smart device today, you are installing a data extraction node in your private sanctuary. But the technology is neutral. We know how to engineer closed-loop systems. We must legally recognize behavioral surplus as the sovereign property of the individual. Harari offers an actionable mandate, an absolute ban on fake humans. If an algorithm is participating in the network, it must explicitly declare its non-human status. Just as it is illegal to print counterfeit currency because it destroys trust in the financial system, it must be illegal to deploy counterfeit humans because it destroys the trust required for democracy. You have a right to know if you are debating a fellow human with a stake in the future or an extraction machine optimizing for a corporate metric. Reclaiming the network requires the deliberate reintroduction of friction, speed limits on the extraction machinery. So next time you scroll past a 50-page terms of service, pause. Inject a moment of friction. Ask yourself, are you utilizing the machine to expand your agency, or is the machine utilizing you to expand its supply routes? Are you the sovereign user or the raw material? The digital realm is not an X-ray of reality. It's a mirror maze where architects charge third parties to subtly alter your reflection. One final provocation. AI models are currently trained on our human data, but we are approaching a threshold where the volume of synthetic data, AI bots talking to bots, will surpass genuine human data. Computer scientists call this model collapse. What happens when AI trains primarily on its own synthetic hallucinations? Will the mirror maze reflect its distortions into infinite absurdity? Or will the collapse finally provide the friction for humanity to shatter the glass and reclaim the network? Keep questioning the architecture.